I would like to welcome all of you on behalf of the organizers of the New York Encounter to this session entitled The Father, Who Is He? My name is Steve Brown. I'm Vice Provost and Dean of Graduate Studies and a Professor of Mechanical Engineering at the Catholic University of America. And I'm also the father of 6 children ranging in ages from 22 to 11. And if I think back to the time before I had these children, I guess it never occurred to me to ask the question, what is a father? It was just that one day I woke up and I found myself a father. And so sitting here today, I ask myself, how is it that I've learned to be a father? And I guess if I think, I could have perhaps read a book about how to be a father or dummies for fathers or something like that. But it seems to me that would be incomplete and not very helpful. Instead, if I look, what I've done through life is I've looked at how other people have been fathers. And first of all, I've been a son to my own father. And so thus for me, first of all, fatherhood means that I must be a son. And this, to me, means that I have to allow myself to be loved. Because without being loved, I simply cannot love. Said differently, I can only give over that which I first of all have been given. And thus, to love, I have to accept being a creature, my creatureliness, and to live my original dependence on God. Or said differently, I must existentially live the expression that was so dear to Father Giussani from Jeremiah, I have loved you with an everlasting love. Because it's to recognize that in a certain sense, I've been a thought of God from all eternity, so to speak, that my very life is gift. So returning once again to the birth of my own children, I guess you could say I was not any different than most fathers, and that I naturally desired the best for them. But what I've discovered in time is that I do not determine the destiny of the child. And perhaps this became most existentially clear to me at the birth of my 4th child, Carlo, who has Down syndrome. And while all my children have been incredible gifts, Carlo, in a particular way, has been an unbelievable gift for many reasons, not least of which is that I've learned through his life that to be human, that is, to be a father, is to be loved and to love. One could say that in a very mysterious way, through my relationship with him, I've learned better what it means to love God, my wife, myself, and my other children. And what one discovers through a life, particularly if one's given the gift of a child like Carlo, is that the hopes and plans that one may have for a child tend to be, for the most part, reductive. That is, the destiny of the child is always greater than whatever hopes and plans I may have for the child, no matter how good they may be in themselves. So I've learned to be a father is to accompany the child in living his destiny, or said differently, to accompany him to living out the plan that God has had for him in a certain sense from all eternity. I guess you could say what I've discovered through the gift of Carlo and all of my children is to ask myself always, who am I to say how healthy or sick a life may be, how long or how short a life may be, how productive or non-productive, so to speak, a life may be, how rich or how happy one will be. Can I give myself another instant of life? Can I give them another instant of life? Can I make them healthy? Can I make myself healthy? The obvious answer to those questions is no, because life is pure gift. So for me, to be a father is to existentially discover and make transparent in my life the truth of this lived experience, and thus in this way communicate to the child the truth of this fact also for his life. And so today, me personally, what I hope from this panel is that I learn more and more what it is to be a father from these 3 fantastic and illustrious panelists sitting here. And I'm going to now introduce them all together at one time, and then we'll have them each individually speak. So to my far left, your far right, is Dr. Paul Vitz. He's a senior scholar and professor at the Institute for the Psychological Sciences in Arlington, Virginia, and professor emeritus at New York University. He obtained his PhD from Stanford University. He devoted his entire professional life to the integration of Christian theology, especially Catholic anthropology, with psychology. He is the author of numerous books and articles. He's married with Evelyn Burge Vitz, best known as Timmy, and they have 6 grown children. And here it says 18, but you told me 21 grandchildren, correct? Yeah, 21 grandchildren. And then to my immediate left, and to my right for you, is Dominic Aquila. and his wife, Diane, of 34 years, are proud parents of 11 children and grandparents of 3. He's a professor of history at the University of St. Thomas in Houston, Texas. And from 2008 to 2017, he served as the university's provost, vice president for academic affairs, and dean of graduate studies. During his 35-year career in higher education, he has also served as a faculty member at a number of other colleges and universities across a range of disciplines, including art history, business ethics, great books, history, humanities, management, marketing, music, political science, and theater. Before his career in higher education, Dr. Aquila was a professional musician in New York City and held administrative positions in the American Symphony Orchestra, the Rochester Philharmonic, and Garth Fagan's Dance Theater. And then here to my left in the middle is Camil Martinez. She was born in Puerto Rico and moved to New York City in 2008. She holds an industrial engineering degree from Case Western University and has worked as an engineer for Hewlett-Packard and British Petroleum. She has also taught mathematics in high school in New York, and she is currently pursuing a PhD in supply chain and logistics at the University of Maryland. And so, again, I'd like to welcome all 3 of you, and we're going to begin with Dr. Vitz.
Hello, everybody, and I'd like to thank CL for this invitation, which is both a pleasure and an honor. My talk this morning will be divided into 2 parts. One focused on research in psychology that's relevant to the importance of fathers in the family, and the other will be an address that I haven't tried before, in which I discuss the relevance of fathers and fatherhood to what might be called the identity crisis that so many people in the world today seem to be facing. To begin, I have a lot of research on the importance of fathers, and I can't go into that in detail to talk about the authors and the methodologies and so on. So instead, what I'm going to do is just highlight the major findings. I can do that in roughly 10 minutes before I get to the second half. If anyone is really interested in all the references and things of that kind, you can get in touch with me and I will email you more than you probably will like to read. To begin, I think that most people recognize we have been in this culture and in many parts of the world in a family crisis. And I think most of us understand that a significant part of that family crisis has been the crisis of fatherhood, namely the absence of fathers in so many of our families. And one of the things that we need to now come to grips with is the clear evidence of the importance of fathers. And fathers and young men need to know about this to understand that when they are called to being fathers, and I think all men are called to being fathers in some way. That doesn't mean necessarily natural fathers. You can be called as a mentor, as a leader, as a coach. There are many ways, but men's masculinity, I think, reaches its highest form when it is expressed in the loving guidance and attention of a father. And so you can be a father in many different ways. I will talk most about the research which has to do with fathers who were biological fathers. It's probably one of the best demonstrated empirical findings, namely the importance of fathers for their children in the entire social science literature. It's also one of the least known in our culture and one of the least known kinds of intelligence and understanding, one of the least known in our media and popular society. First, research has overwhelmingly shown that the presence of the father is extraordinarily significant for not only the mother, but for the children. What are the major findings? The commonest finding for boys who are raised without fathers is their very much higher increase of criminal behavior, juvenile delinquency, ending up in prison, and use of drugs. Now, the use of drugs and involvement in criminal behavior is found in studies in the United States, studies in Great Britain, and studies in South America, studies in Europe, studies in Asia. So this is a universal phenomenon. Now, in the United States alone, we have a very high prison population. And so the social cost of boys being raised without fathers is enormous. Not only is it the cost of keeping them in prison every year, which is equivalent to the cost of a private education, but it's the cost of all those blighted lives. And so remember then that one of the major common findings is fatherless boys are very much more likely, not certainly, but much more likely to get involved in criminal behavior and in drugs. A second very important finding is that children without fathers are much more vulnerable to emotional illness. This is apparently especially true of daughters. Depression is much commoner in daughters who grew up without fathers. It's also mental illness of other kinds is also more common in boys as well. But so a second aspect of the failure of the father to be in the family is the statistical average of greater psychological problems, depression, and so on. A third consequence of being raised without fathers, for which there's a good deal of research, is lower cognitive skills. The children, when fathers aren't there, tend to be less, they get lower IQ scores, they don't do as well in school, they don't graduate as often, they're much more likely to leave school. Children without fathers are 4 times less likely to succeed at getting a job. It's amazing. The absence of the father, therefore, leads to not just criminal and drug behavior. I haven't gone into all the stuff on drugs, but you can imagine that, and sometimes alcohol. But it also leads to emotional and cognitive deficits. Now, the research on when fathers are present shows essentially the opposite kinds of findings. They show that when fathers are present, the child is much more likely to graduate, much more likely to do well in school, much more likely to get higher cognitive scores and to get a job. So one of our problems today in our society is the presence of young men, particularly, who are in prison. Some people have called our prisons essentially boarding houses for fatherless children, and the social cost that goes with it. With daughters, fatherless daughters tend to be sexually more mature at an early age. They tend to be more sexually active. They tend to seem to be looking for affirmation from male figures. So this 14-year-old girl thinks that an 18-year-old man is a father figure, and they get involved in sexual behavior. She gets pregnant, she gets an abortion, or maybe she raises the child as a single mother, and all sorts of positive futures for her life have been removed. So those are some of the negative effects of what happens when fathers aren't present. One of the other effects that was found in studies done on cultures, some 50 or 60 of them all over the world, was that when fathers are present in the family, the mothers do a better job at mothering. And that, now you think about it, well, of course, having another parent around, that helps, right? But one of the things it did is the morale of the mothers was much higher because the fathers agreed that children, and in particular their children, were important. And so when their morale was better, they did a better job of mothering. Now, what are the sort of the major reasons that one might think that fathers, what are the sort of the summary of the kinds of things that they do in the family that make a big difference? And let me summarize them. I don't know if I'm halfway through yet. Almost, okay. It turns out that fathers are the primary source of the children's self-regulation. They learn to inhibit bad behavior, and they learn to, particularly with boys, inhibit aggression, and sexuality. And the father doesn't have to be some big whiz-dang of a psychologist. He can be your typical truck driver who says to the son, "Don't talk to your mother like that. She's my wife, or I'll beat you up." Well, he learns two things from that: to respect his mother, and two, to start inhibiting his aggression. Young men need to learn to inhibit their natural aggressive tendencies. I think I'll tell a little story about something that's analogous. An experiment happened by accident in South Africa in one of the big national parks. They had a lot of young bull elephants, and they didn't know quite what to do with them, so they took the bull elephants who were young and separated them out and put them in a huge area of the park by themselves. In a little while, they noticed that these young bull elephants were extraordinarily aggressive. They started killing rhinos, and rhinos they never had attacked in the other part of the park ever before, and rhinos are a protected species too. And they started digging up and knocking down trees and fighting with each other, and they didn't know what was going on. So one smart ranger said, "Let's go get the old bull elephants and bring about 10 or 20 of those and put them in there." And they did that. And just the presence of those older bulls dampened down the aggressive expression of the young bulls. We don't know how that was communicated in elephant speak, but it was communicated. And maybe it was, "Don't talk to your mother like that or I'll beat you up." But self-regulation is extraordinarily important for children to learn. There are now research showing that self-regulation is more important in school success than IQ. More important. So that's one thing fathers do. Halfway. Well, I got to go quickly over two more and then we'll go, Fathers are also a major source of gender identity for boys. That's how they learn to be a man, by looking at their father. They know they're different from their mother, but they don't know who they are unless the father is there or a father figure to model. They also help girls. If the father is affectionate and supportive of the daughter, she doesn't have to go looking out for some kind of male affirmation when she hits 14. So they're very important in that way. There are two basic tasks that children of all kinds have. They have to separate and individuate from the mother, and they have to learn their sexual identity. I've already mentioned that the sexual identity is very important in terms of the father's role. But children have to learn to separate from their mother and individuate and become individuals of a distinct kind. And the fathers very much help this, particularly with daughters who naturally tend to be more merged and connected to their mothers. And so the fathers help the daughters separate from the mother, and they, in all cases, help daughters and sons to deal with the outside world more. They may take them camping or fishing or to the office or whatever, but fathers take the child into the outside world and give them a link there. And finally, fathers are known to be, and this is at least, I think, in the Christian world, but it may be a very general one, fathers are known to be the major passer-on of religion, even more than the mothers. Fatherless families lose their religion much more significantly than those that have fathers. So that's part of the world that the fathers are bringing. And I've mentioned in this a number of things, and we'll now go to the second half, about identity. One of the things a father brings to his children is the identity of the child in the social sense. Who am I? And children want to know who their father was and who their grandfather was and what they're part of in terms of a personal, family-based identity. And so they're very important at that. But at present in our culture and in the world, we're having a huge identity crisis. Why is that? One part is the absence of fathers, but there's more. There's an identity crisis because of the disintegration of the family. In some cases, even the mother isn't present. In some cases, because of divorce and things like that, you don't know who your family is. You know, who these new people you meet through the new marriages and all of that. The family, the father isn't there for identity. The family isn't there for identity. Other things aren't there for identity anymore. We don't have regional identities. You know, I used to know people who were proud they were from Virginia, and others who were prouder still they were from Louisiana. Come on, now, those identities about location are gone. Many national identities, patriotism is declining. And people who are immigrants have an identity problem. And there are lots of immigrants in the world today because they don't know quite yet, are they part of the new place they're in, or are they still from the old place? So we have an enormous identity crisis. And this will lead to identity politics. And we've all seen the effects of identity politics. It leads one group to be hostile to another. So how can we find unity? How can we find the unity that this conference is supposed to try to help promote or to discover? And I would say that one way we can discover it is through understanding that we are all children of God. We are all children of God. We are all in the same family. And if you don't have a father, the faith offers you many father figures. Your priests, the saints, Saint Joseph, many father figures, and of course our Lord. And we offer other members of the family too. We offer Our Lady. We offer in her the mother that maybe many people didn't have. But it brings us together in the sense of all being part of one family, and at the same time, we're as diverse as can be. We're from different languages, different ethnic groups, different cultures, different histories. But because we're all of one family and have our identity there, we don't have to engage in identity politics. My identity is not because I'm American or British or from Puerto Rico or Colombia or wherever, and I can see the world out there in front of me. We can still have that, but it's not in hostility, in rejection to the other identities. We are part of the single family of God. Thank you.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you for being here. I want to especially express gratitude to Angelo Sala and all those who organized this conference. We do something on a much smaller scale in Houston from time to time, and I know what kind of work goes into this, and the amount of attention to detail here and hospitality is truly amazing. So thank you all for that. If there's a theme to what I'm going to say, it comes from a movie you may remember, Brother, Where Art Thou?, which is a kind of modern retelling of the Odyssey, which is also a kind of metaphor for my life, and my life together with my wife and children. There's a moment in the film, George Clooney character, after an enormous amount of frustration, and you know the story of how frustrating the Odyssey is, says, "Am I not the damn paterfamilias?" and had to assert his role. Well, it is what it is, but my kids picked that up. And they would play it back to me from time to time and call me the damn paterfamilias. In a way, speaking about my experience of fatherhood, I'm an anomalous example. I tend to subscribe to this cliche, the way you do anything is the way you do everything. So I do things with great intensity. So even becoming first a husband to my wonderful wife Diane, and then a father, I thought seriously about the role, especially the educative role. And I'm an academic. And one of the things that I wanted to do from the outset is make my professional life and my family life as seamless as possible. Because as Dr. Vitz said, it's very important for people to see, sons and daughters, to see their father's work. And I remember how valuable that was to me. My father worked as a civilian for the U.S. Army. How important it was for me to visit his place of work a couple of times a year. It was very important because he goes away for most of the day and then comes back. Where does he go? And so that was very important, and I wanted to build that into our life. So the life of an academic is a privileged life. To reverse Thorstein Veblen's famous, his book, The Theory of the Leisure Class, I always said it's the leisure of the theory class. And so you have a life, a professional life that enables you to spend more time with your family. But because of the nature of the work, I was always able to have my family see the kind of work I do. And that had its ups and downs, mostly good, because when there were frustrations professionally, sometimes my kids took it to heart. But on the other hand, when we talked about how do you become resilient, how do you respond to those setbacks and challenges in professional life, I tried to be a model for that. Now, as I said, both my strength and my weakness is this intensity with which I tend to do everything. So a good Catholic boy, a product of Catholic schools in Brooklyn, wonderful teachers and sisters and brothers all the way through. I was very serious about how a Catholic father ought to raise a family. And Dr. Vitz talked about the absence of fatherhood. I was very aware of the presence of bad fatherhood and how damaging that could be. So I looked very much in depth at what the Catholic faith and what I learned could teach me about being a father. And through that kind of conversation with my wife, we decided very early on that we would homeschool our kids. So that's kind of anomalous. Not everyone can do that. And for me and for my wife, what that meant was the education of our children, which is what the Catholic Church teaches, is a primary function of parents, was going to be a serious project. And I drew on the Catholic principle of subsidiarity. You may remember that that's a principle that says that things are done at the place closest to the people who are affected by it. So you don't, go too high to solve a problem if you can solve it lower. And education seemed to me to fall into that category. And so now, when we did homeschooling back in the 1980s, we started in New York, and nobody knew what to do with homeschooling. They didn't know what to do with us. They sent us books, and they said, okay, just stay away. Now, of course, if you go on the internet, there's too much. But when our philosophy of homeschooling was based upon many things, but we looked at the schools and we found them, even the most celebrated schools, were lacking something. And I wanted something as important as education to be grounded in the home. And the principle of subsidiarity meant is that in the home, Diane and I would take care of the education of our children until we couldn't. And the benefit of having kids taught at home, and each of the 11 are all very, very different. But we get to see how they are, how they develop, what their talents are, what their interests are, what their talents are, and move them in a direction some did go to school for a little bit, some didn't. But it was very serious responsibility that we are the primary educators. And so I'm not going to outsource that responsibility. Instead, I took the responsibility, and then based on each of my kids' needs, we sent them to schools, if necessary or not. My wife wound up developing a number of successful cooperatives, parent cooperatives. And this was a great experience because parents who didn't have certain skills could rely on other parents. But I also, besides that, I remember growing up, where do you learn to be a father, right? Your first examples are your own father. I came from a very tight-knit Italian-American family in a very tight-knit neighborhood. So I got wonderful examples of how not just my father took responsibility for me, but how other men also were interested in me. And they weren't getting paid to do it. The baseball coach, a man who dedicated his life to just making sure that kids my age, early teens, would be able to play the game of baseball, have good sportsmanship, and that's all he cared about. He had a job, but that was his interest. The great priests and brothers that taught me, I saw how they mentored and how serious they were about that. And so drawing on those examples, and then being an academic, I also did reading into the history of the family and found that it's always been the case that in good families, mothers and fathers, particularly fathers, had to identify other people in the community. Could be a relative, it could be just trusted friends, who would also be invited in to mentor the kids. There's a wonderful book called The Puritan Family by a great historian, Edmund Morgan. And he makes a big point of this, is that in Puritan society, the identification of a child's vocation, and they would principally be boys, was so important that at the age of about 13, 14, a boy would be sent to another trusted household to make sure and check whether this vocational aspiration a boy had was good or not. And so that example that I learned just by observing my own growing up, and then reading academic literature, that became a very important part of how we and how I exercised my fatherhood. Now, the experience of fatherhood for me is, and this gets better all the time, is I become students of my kids because they have developed their own interests and they become better at things than I am. And one of the greatest joys I have is having them come back and teach me or talk about me, have me recommend books that I should read, recommend music that I should listen to, or an artist that I should be looking at. So it's that kind of reciprocity of I being and Diane being in the role of educators who take that seriously, loving parents, and then the joy of having your kids come back and take their position as responsible adults in society. Well, I can't think of anything more rewarding than that. And as each of our children were born, my oldest son now is 33, and they all go down about every 2 years to my youngest daughter, Carmela, who's about 14, is that, and I think everyone experiences this, every time there's a new kid born into the family, things change, right? The dynamics. It's a community that was one way yesterday, like Father Caron was saying at the homily today. Yesterday, it was one way, the birth of a new child. Tomorrow, it's something, the whole community of family is different. The community of friendships is different. And that is an enormous reward. But finally, I would like to say that I and my wife have always been fortunate to be in supportive communities for what we do. And our reliance on the Catholic Church, the faith, has been an enormous help. I really believe that we couldn't have been the mother and father that we are without our deep faith and commitment to our community. And we've traveled a lot. The life of an academic is itinerant. And so I dragged my family from New York all the way now to Houston and many stops in the Midwest. But it was the fact that we held together as a family, homeschooling helped that, made that transition possible. So I would say that, again, my situation, Diane's situation, we're anomalous, not everyone homeschools. That has been, I think, a very positive development in our life. But now we're at the point of saying, how many others can enjoy the benefits of that? If you can't homeschool, what about this notion of subsidiarity? And having parents, especially fathers, take note that the responsibility of education is really a serious one. And you just don't mindlessly outsource it to the state or anybody else. It's something that you have to constantly be involved in. And not for the sake of just, getting ahead, getting into the right schools, but making sure you get an education that is going to be worthy of a human being. Thank you.
I am clearly not a father, so I'm going to speak as a daughter. My name is Camil Martinez, and Monsignor Lorenzo Albacete was my father, and I was his favorite. If you're in the audience and you were fathered by him too, you're probably thinking, that girl's crazy. I was his favorite. And you'll be right. Because the first thing to know about Lorenzo is that he had such a capacity to love you for who you were, that you would feel so preferred. Like, he made you feel like you were his favorite person in the world. And he loved and preferred every single one of us that God gave him to father. And God, we are so many, and I know that. Although I had met him before, my relationship with him developed here in New York. I belong to the movement of communal liberation, and so did he. And I came to New York to follow in the path of my vocation. I lived here in New York for 4 years in a house of people that dedicate their lives to Christ. And he was an authority figure for this house, and therefore he was an authority figure for my vocation. He called our house the House of the Virgins in Bronxville, which we only allowed him to say. And so he was often at our house because more than anything, he shared his life with us. So we had privileges like driving him around, which in my case meant to put him in panic every time because I am always lost. And so he was always afraid I would get him lost. Cooking for him, having dinners with him, going to talks that he was giving, doing confession. We really shared a life with him. From the moment that I arrived to New York, he became my father. He loved me from day one, no questions. He didn't know me, he loved me. The day that I became his daughter, that one I remember perfectly. I had decided to go to confession with him because I was struggling with confession, and I thought, well, he's a priest, he can help me. And I asked him. And then as I arrived to this moment, I thought, no, wait, what was I thinking? Now he's going to see everything. He's not going to love me anymore. This is the worst idea I ever had. So I hesitated. But as I started my confession, I started telling him not to look at me. And I started listing my sins, like, oh yeah, I do this, I am like this. He started saying like, oh yeah, I do that too. So, as I am covering my eyes because I didn't want him to look at me because I am confessing all the evil things that I do, I was like, what? And so I kept going. I do this too, and I do that. And he said like, oh yeah, me too. So by the third time he said it, I raised my gaze and I said, look, is this my confession or your confession? Because let me tell you something, absolution is going this way. This way, there's nothing I can do for you. And so we laughed, and then he was like, you know, this is a sacrament, serious thing, we're not supposed to be laughing. And when I finished, I felt the weight of all my fear, you know, to have let somebody just see everything, and I really thought, like, this is it, like, why was I so stupid? And instead, his answer was, he said, well, now that we have discovered each other accomplices in sin, let's pray together so that we can always find each other accomplices in redemption. With the most incredibly merciful gaze that I have ever seen. And so this is the gaze that entered my life, the mercy of somebody that sees everything and comes with you. No claim, no scandal, comes with you to discover redemption. So this is the gaze that I would try to describe to you today. Lorenzo was not afraid of anything as he was in panic about everything. He was very easy to put in panic. He was a hypochondriac, so every other day he was convinced that he had the latest cancer that had been discovered and that he was suddenly going to die. But he would never go to the doctor because why would you go to the doctor? They're only going to discover that there's something wrong with you. So there was no way. He was obsessed with his own death. He told me once that when he was 33, he spent the whole year thinking that some catastrophic event was going to happen to him because Jesus died at 33, so of course he would too. There was no way to make him do an effort that he was convinced that was not necessary. So like driving him around, he would drive me crazy because you basically had to put him inside the building he was going to, in Manhattan. So I would go nuts. But there was no way to justify any kind of effort. Suffering was not right. It was just not. He was obsessed with the weather, so hurricanes were madness. I am convinced that as Hurricane Maria was striking Puerto Rico, he was telling to somebody in heaven, I knew it, I knew it. So there was no way that you would make him think that it was okay to suffer. And yet, he was the person that accepted suffering in the freest, most incredible way that I have ever seen. If he was convinced that Christ was asking, he would accept anything. There was absolutely no question. The only reason for suffering was the cross of Christ, to love Christ. If it will make you love Christ, he would do anything. One time I went to him to complain because I was exhausted of the cultural/vocational shock that I was going through. I was here in New York, I was living with Americans and with Italians, I was doing a job that I had never done before. I was just exhausted. So I went to him and I complained about everything and everyone. And then at the end I said, why do I have to be so problematic? You know, why can't I just be easygoing? And he answered to me, you know, the church is always going through a conversion from the particular to the universal. God has chosen the flesh, and so everything has to start in a carnal, particular way. But then it has to become Catholic, and to become for everyone, it has to go through a pain in a flesh too. because you have to let go of what is not as essential. And this is always suffered in the flesh. And so he said, what you're suffering is the universality of the church. Would you do this for Jesus? With this gaze again. There's nobody that was able to ask you to love Christ, to beg you to love Christ like Lorenzo could. And so when he told me like this, it was clear to me that there was no space for me versus them, cultural differences. You just got here, you need time, you're right, they're wrong, they are right, you're wrong. These were all secondary things. The only thing that matters is that you do things for a greater love. So the question was always, who do you love? Another time, I was reading the life of Saint Teresa of Avila. He had suggested it. And when I arrived to the mystical episodes, I got really scared. I was like, this woman is kind of crazy. She's talking to Jesus. Jesus tells her what to do. She does it. So I asked him, how does the church know that she was just not crazy? I mean, out of all the crazy people throughout history that have claimed to talk to Jesus, how do you know the true one? And he said to me, your problem is that you think that crazy has nothing to do with Christ, that is an objection. And he said, think about what you're saying. If Christ cannot win over crazy, then there is a space of the experience of humanity that he cannot conquer and win over. And so sanctity and crazy are not mutually exclusive. For all we know, she could have been crazy. Because Jesus can use a certain state of mind to get into a relationship with you. So she might have been crazy, who cares? Lorenzo was as funny as he was serious and passionate about life. So you have to understand that he was Puerto Rican. And we have a certain incapacity to stay in seriousness. I mean, we dance when we suffer, we sing when we weep. It's enough to watch some videos after Hurricane Maria where people are like dancing on the street as they wait 9 hours for 2 gallons of gas. And he was the most Puerto Rican of us all. So he was really funny, but his jokes were always serious. It was the way that he processed things. So the funnier the joke, the deeper he was going. And we were educated as we laughed. And one day we were at the house and we were waiting to have a meeting, so it was just the two of us in a room. And so he suddenly, with his serious face, asked me, what language do you think that Mary speaks to the Trinity when they talk? That was like, what? Who thinks of these things? And how am I supposed to know? And he said, well, she's human, so they have to communicate in a human way. Humans speak, so what language? And then he told me that he was convinced that they spoke in Puerto Rican Spanish. And he started what could have been an incredible skit, making episodes for me of Jesus' childhood and Jesus as a teenager, as Mary was sending him to do errands, speaking like a Puerto Rican mother. I was on the floor laughing. But he would often do that. He had so many gospel jokes. If you knew him, you have heard his versions of the blind man and the shepherd that left 99 sheep. And my favorite, the Annunciation. But these jokes will make you understand that he was constantly thinking about Jesus, and he was constantly trying to understand, what does it mean that he's flesh now? Incarnation was definitely the fascination of Lorenzo's life. Lorenzo was a man that had the desire of all things and preferred God above everything. This point is crucial to understand who he was, because there was no moralism on this man, like absolutely no moralism. He desired everything. And in his obedience, which was his life, was a total preference to God. For him, desire was crucial because he kept discovering in life that God was just more attractive. And this was it. So I have two examples of this. Every year when I was with him, he was invited to speak at the meeting of Rimini. And every year he wouldn't answer if he was going or not, which drove people crazy, also us. So one time, kind of annoyed, I asked him, why don't you answer to those poor people? Like, you're in no condition to travel. You're not going. So why don't you just tell them, just answer? He was sad. I had hurt him. And so he looked at me and said, I was somebody. I used to go around the world speaking, and people would listen to what I have to say. Thousands of people would wait for me and would wait to see what I had to say, and I loved it. I really enjoyed it. But what I have come to discover of Christ these few years were tough years. He was going through a lot of suffering. He couldn't travel anymore. The things that I have lost, I would not change anything for what I have learned from Christ. I have come to know him in a way that if this is the price I have to pay, I am happy to never go again. But why won't you let me dream? As I don't answer, I keep thinking that maybe I can go. That day, I saw a man. His obedience was so glad that it had given me the impression that he didn't care about these things. Instead, I understood that he was letting them go. He was constantly letting go. The last time I saw him, he was in the hospital dying. He was full of desire in the hospital. He kept telling me that we should go dancing and that we should go to Puerto Rico and eat some pig. And, and he kept asking me for Puerto Rican candy. He wanted to eat, he wanted to dance, he wanted to go out. So he was full of desire. But he was completely aware that he was dying, and he was at peace with that. And so it took me a moment. I was confused. I didn't understand how these two things could go together. It was the only time that I saw that restless heart at peace. And I understood that he did not want to say when he was dying. He was waiting for God to come. And this waiting was full of life and full of desire. And I understood that I want to live the way that I saw him die. But this peace was deep at heart. His crazy personality was there until the end. So he kept telling me in the hospital, take me out of here. I have things to do. Let's go out. And I kept saying, yeah, let's go. So he kept saying, let's just go home. And I was like, yeah, let's just go home. And at a certain point, he got angry at me, and he said, why aren't you doing anything? I'm telling you, get me out of here. So I was holding his hand, which I was often doing. It was the affectionate gesture that I had developed towards him. So I was holding his hand, and I looked at him, and I said, I can't take you out of here. And he said, well, why? And I said, well, because you know very well that right now it's your task to be on this bed, and it's my task to be holding this hand, and there's nothing else to do here. He looked at me in fury and said, well, who the hell would want that? And I said, yeah, we were always the rebels. Obedience was never our fascination, was it? But it is what we do, isn't it? He looked at me with that incredible gaze again. He never asked me again to get him out. And so I stayed there holding his hand until it was time for me to go. That was the last time I saw him. This is who he was, and this is who he taught me to be. We had indeed become accomplices in redemption, because that is the way that he always treated me. there was a mysterious battle going on inside of Lorenzo, and it was clear to me that Christ was winning. And the hardest thing about loving the freedom of somebody is to let them be that intimate relationship with the mystery, where you're not invited to intervene. Like I saw him, he was suffering, he was dying, and I wish I could make it stop. You know, like you wish you could make God change his mind just to make it stop. But he had taught me to trust God, to respect the freedom of God, and to just let God do what he had to do, because that's where he comes to meet you. And so I understood that that was the only thing I had to do also with him. And so to finish, I sincerely hope that one day the victory that I saw those days can shine through my eyes one day when God wants. Because life and death with Lorenzo were the adventure to discover Christ's win over and over again. And his absolute love for Christ was a love that I participated in. And when you have been part of a love like that, you're free. This is Christianity. The Father is the one that teaches you to be truly free. Thank you.
So I'd like to thank all three of the panelists, and we still have a few more minutes, so I'm going to turn to each of them and ask them a brief question here before we finally thank all of them. All right, I'm being told that we don't really have time for that. So as an obedient son, I would like to thank all of them again and thank all of you for your participation.